start bang on the hour here?
I think we can get going. You will see that more people will show up as we get going, but if we wait, it seems like no one shows up, and when we just get started, people start logging in like crazy. So
Well,
hopefully we can.
I used to do presentations where people were tardy, and I'd always put the best stuff in the first 5 minutes, and then if you missed it, so much. But
All right. So
this one will build.
I started the recording, so it's going at this point. And thanks, Carl, for talking to us today about the mass care planning tool.
All righty. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. The 33 of you that are on schedule, I think we had a total of 60 some sign up for the class. So we'll go from there. But what I wanted to do is introduce you to a new tool, and you'll notice the part here in the middle. This is a preview. The new mass care planning tools and a lot of the new planning tools were all scheduled for release in June. And somehow or another, this little COVID-19 compendium got in the way. So the 105-page compendium needed to get out first, and the planning tools have been delayed and should be out in July. But when I discussed this class with the team at NHQ, they said the new tool is a lot better. It's going to be out in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. So let's just show you the new tool, and so you can see what's in there. Hopefully some of you have seen the old tool and will be able to see what's improved. Okay, so most of you have been through at least one or two classes. Many of you I've seen in my previous classes, so the housekeeping isn't a major item. But the first part here is just to understand your platform, and something that comes up in many meetings is the buttons move around depending on which device you're on. If you're on a tablet, or if you're on a phone, or if you're on a PC or Mac, etc. But they all have the same basic features. You all by now know how to mute and unmute, which is the buttons here when you scroll to the bottom of the screen. You can have your video on when you speak. It's really nice for engagement so people can see you. If you want to use closed captioning, hit the three buttons in the middle, and one of the options is closed captioning. It actually does a pretty good job of doing speech recognition on the fly. For questions, I'd appreciate it if you can raise your hand. It'll help prevent people from talking over each other. The comments in chat are certainly appreciated, and you know the other buttons in terms of the participants and how to leave the meeting. I request courtesy, if you can, to others, and I know you'll all be there, so on with the purpose. The real purpose of the mass care planning tool is to help you scale an operation quickly. One of the most difficult things we have in the Red Cross is knowing how to start up an operation and scale it to the point we need to take care of the clients that have been impacted. It is very easy for us to overshoot or undershoot. And a lot of that is, certainly if you grew up through the Red Cross when I did, to become a mass care chief, it was an apprenticeship program. And I think others on this call had the same thing. You had to apprentice. There was no doctrine, there was no lore. You just learned it from somebody else, so you had a good way of estimating. What's happening now with the planning team at National, and Michael Whitehead is leading that charge, is taking mathematical modeling and proper planning to figure out how to scale appropriately. I'm going to mute everyone here. Okay. If you need to come off mute, you'll have to do it yourself now that you've been muted. So part of the tools I'll be describing is how to scale an operation quickly based on historical information and the best estimates we can get on the actual impact. The second part of this is to look specifically at the mass care planning tool, which is the whole title of the presentation. So learning objectives: build awareness of the new planning tool, understand how it fits in the planning process, provide some training on how to use the tool itself, and then to also show some linkage between the tools. None of these tools exists in a vacuum. There are a series of them now that are being connected to provide a unified view of the operation. So this is the ultimate outcome. We have the planning cycle of forming the team, understanding the situation, developing the goals, developing the plan, which is what the tool is used for, and then having the plan reviewed and then, of course, implemented. This is a view of what the new planning tool presents, which is an advanced operational plan with bar charts and graphs as far as what the operation is going to try and achieve. It's very elegant, and it produces a very readable plan. All of you should have seen this earlier. This is in ConOps. You have to start with an operation. Feeding tends to lag sheltering, and then the other operations. And as I note, in many of our operations here, especially wildfires, while an earthquake may have equal damage on all sides, a wildfire on the side that is the leading edge where it's burning, we're still doing evacuations, where on the other side where it started, we're often repopulating. So you may have multiple graphs where you're doing sheltering in one area and you're distributing emergency supplies and client casework on another district in that same operation. So think of that as each side needs to be treated appropriately for the right stage it is at, not just the overall operation. In terms of the planning tools, where we fit in here, the tool we're going to be talking about fits right in here, the DRO Advanced Operational Plan. Before that is the deliberate plan, and the doctrine on the deliberate plan should be out in July as well. And you may revise the operation plan as your operation changes in sections. There's a parallel process at national, and then there's also the service delivery plan, which is more on the budget side, and we have a presentation on that next week. And of course, everybody's pretty familiar now with the IAP, the Incident Action Plan. So what does the operational plan do, and how does the mass care planning tool, which you all came to the seminar because you wanted to talk about a mass care planning tool? Well, the secret behind the curtain is the mass care planning tool is a tool to generate an advanced operational plan. So they are one and the same with different names in many ways. It's all about what and where you need to provide support, what level of service, what amount of Red Cross resources, and that's where everything is really focused. As some emergency planner mentioned to me, it's actually not a disaster if you have all the resources you need, right? If you can do it, then it's routine. If you're stretched, now you've got a real disaster to work on. What additional resources are required, and what level of service has the Red Cross committed to by when? This is an example of a full plan with the timeline, the key capacities, and the decision points, and then the associated map that comes with it. And you'll see much of this chart in the mass care management class, as well as in the new planning classes that are coming out. What you need for the MCT, the mass care planning tool, they've really simplified the tool from the current one that you can download off the Exchange. Sheltering is down to really 3 questions. How many shelters do you plan to open? How many people total sheltered? And what type of shelters are you going to be opening? And that's it. You answer those 3 questions and it generates a plan. And I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes when we go to the actual tool. Feeding as well as simplified. These aren't all the questions in feeding. We'll cover them a little bit later, but these are the sort of 4 questions that you start with. Maximum number of meals, maximum number of shelter locations, because that determines how many vehicles you need. Amount of community feeding, and then later on, what type of plan you're going to have. Are you going to be catering, or are you going to have kitchens? So it's really quite simple to come up with the information. Also recognize that none of this information comes out of the tool. These are the inputs to the tool. So the first question a lot of people have is, it's great, I can use the tool, but where do I get this stuff? This is the starting point. The starting point for any of the information is what happened. Where do you get estimates of the damage? And certainly here in California, wildfires are our most common one. So for us, that's CAL FIRE. I'm sure there's an equivalent for every other state that provides that information, and they normally have information on how many people are evacuated and how many people are threatened. If you're in the islands, or if you're on the southeast, hurricanes are a big factor, and National Hurricane Center provides that information as well. The other one that's available and becoming more popular is some of our regions have implemented population impact tools into RCView. So this is an example of one that was created by Sandra Hayden here in the Northern California region, where you can just select a region. It has the overlays of population from census, and it also has vulnerability index, and you can just have it tell you how many people are going to be impacted by this disaster in that area. So how many people live in these areas that were impacted by this earthquake in this case. And it'll give you the numbers, and it'll break it all down. It's a very handy tool. For some reason, my screen jumped. The last one that's up here is HAZUS, and if you haven't seen it, it's a model that was created by FEMA, and I've been very impressed with the HAZUS modeling. The people at NHQ will run it, and some of the regions know how to run the model. When we had the last earthquake in Alaska, we were having difficulty getting estimates of damage. We pulled down the HAZUS data, and it was within a few percent on both majors and destroyeds and even minors. Affected, it was off by quite a few, but it hit the numbers that most affect the budget and the service delivery very closely. And we had the data on the impact in the first day of the operation. So it was really quite remarkable to use the tools that are being developed. And they have modeling for floods as well as earthquakes in the HAZUS model. You then have to do some magic, and here's where the apprenticeship normally happens. You have to take those numbers of displaced and figure out how many people are going to come to the Red Cross for sheltering. All of us probably in mass care have an estimate for what that means in our area. When I was the mass care lead in our area, that was something I commonly had to figure out is how many people do we expect to be in the shelter? And you'll hear estimates from people of either 10% or 5% or 3%, and it really ranges all over the board. And it is affected a lot by the demographics. If you have well, I think it applies throughout our region. If you have Section 8 housing, the subsidized housing, we sometimes, like for a major apartment fire, we might see 85, 95% of the people come to the shelter. When I ran the numbers for a wildfire in Santa Barbara, I think we might have gotten to 2 or 3% of the affected population sheltered. So it really makes a big difference. My hunch right now is with the COVID environment and the congregate shelters, we're probably going to see a small percentage of the people come. Whereas if we offer non-congregate shelters, hotel rooms, I suspect we get a very high percentage that come. So it's really going to depend on the type of sheltering that we can provide, how many people we get. And not surprisingly, NHQ and Michael Whitehead have a mass care assumptions planning spreadsheet. It's a very detailed sheet. He has trained 7 planners across the country. One of them is in our division here, to use these planning tools to come up with a mathematical projection based on the demographics, based on history of how many people we can expect, rather than the off-the-cuff estimate that all of the mass care chiefs and other planners have come up with over the years. If anybody has any questions along the way, please raise them. I can talk, but I'd love to answer your questions if they come up. One question came up: who's in charge of getting the MCP completed? Excellent question, Phil. It is in the process of moving. Right now, the MCP had been under the guidance of the mass care team, and it used to be included in the mass care management class. It is now moving over to planning in the new planning cycle, and we're sort of in limbo right now because the new planning doctrine has not yet been released, nor has the new tools. But the understanding is it will move like the service delivery plan did, where planning section is responsible for the tool, but they need to rely on others to get the data to put into the tool to do it. So it's really going to be a joint effort between, if you read their doctrine, the mass care chief and the planning lead for level 5 and above operations. For smaller operations, it may be a different combination of people, but for a small operation, it may be the ops AD and the planning AD in that case. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. The secret to how the tool works is all about standards of service and the ratios. And this is something which a lot of companies use and a lot of organizations. And the type is probably too small for you to read in the chart here, but the back of the mass care planning tool has a whole series of charts of how many people are needed for which service. So how many shelter managers do you need, the SH supervisors? Do you need per shelter? Well, you need one, okay? So then if you have 10 shelters, you need 10 of those supervisors. If it's a larger shelter, do you need more supervisors? Yes, you need a supervisor in each shift. So then you bring that up. If you have a ratio of, the common thing we use is not how many toilets do you need per person in a shelter, how many showers, things like that go into the planning of, do you have enough available in that shelter when you open it for the clients that you're planning to put in that shelter. So some of the things I listed here. And you can go across every Red Cross service to try and do a ratio of how many people are needed to accomplish that. When I'm in planning, one of the things I look at a lot is how many caseworkers do we need? You know, how many cases per day can a caseworker work? And it depends whether they're doing outreach or they're doing in a local assistance center. But somewhere in the range of 6 is a good average. So how many days are you going to allocate that? That shows you how many staff you need to do that. So every activity can be built into a ratio of what's the ideal. Now, how does that get modified? Well, what if you have a shelter that has 2 different senior centers evacuated into the shelter? Is that going to require the same amount of staff as if you evacuated a university in there with all students? Probably need a lot more care assistance if you're dealing with seniors, and you'll probably get a lot more assistance if you're dealing with a younger group that can do more services for the shelter, provide more assistance. So it depends a lot on which population you have in the shelter. So ratios are just a line in the sand. That doesn't mean you don't need to move it based on your actuals in your shelter. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at the tool itself. Now, there is also the consideration of this COVID time we're in. The tool has been under development for 2 years. COVID has really been with us for about 3 months. The tool was developed and finalized before the COVID era. That doesn't mean it can't support it. It turns out I met with Mike today, and we can see how to cajole the tool to do what we need now. And I'll talk about that a little more when we get into it. But it's designed around our standard practice, much as the NSS system and many of our other systems are designed around standard practice and not around this point in time. So Stephanie's question is, yes, I'll show you how to set the controls in the planning tool for the smaller shelter teams. Okay. Oh, that is it. Now we move on to the demo. Okay. Peel that one away. And this is the tool itself. Mass Care Planning Tool, June 2020. Now, we don't know exactly what date will be on the actual release one, but this is the one that we're showing you now. And unfortunately, it's not really available for sharing yet, but hopefully you can get it within the next 2 weeks. And let's start with the instructions. So unlike the previous tool, there are very few things that need to be entered. You need to have a starting date, an end date, a DRO number, and the person completing it. And that's it for the instruction page. So there's really not a lot there. The next thing you go, and let's just look at the tabs at the bottom here. You have a sheltering tab. You have the sheltering AOP. You have feeding tab, feeding districts, feeding AOP, and so forth down to DES districts. And then finally at the end here, you have the AOP summary. And then I'll talk a little bit about these later. And here is the service ratios. In the release version of the previous tool, they hid the service ratios, but you can unhide that tab unless they lock it. And if you really need to see it, talk to me and I'll help you get it. Okay, so let's look at the sheltering one first. The sheltering tab, as I mentioned earlier, these are the only two numbers you have to provide up front. And in answer to the question that was raised, if you put in one shelter and you make it 50 people, you can come up with the service ratio by just adjusting the type of shelter. And if you change it to a 24-hour shelter, it turns out you come up with 6 people. So that is the ratio and number that you're looking at in this current era. And so you can come up with various ways of getting there. Now, it's most likely that you're going to need to adjust the service ratios. And rather than cheat that way, you go down to custom. Oh, so let me show you that. So they have the 3 different standards: a standard evacuation shelter, a short-term shelter, which is what our standard shelters are, 2 shifts of for generally 2 to 4 weeks. And you can run it as 3 shifts, or you can do custom. If you do any of the standard ones, all of the service standards are blanked out, so you don't adjust those, and you just work with the default numbers. So the normal one for us would be the short-term shelter, except in the COVID era here. And then if you shifted to a 3-shift shelter, for example, if it was a longer duration, like during the campfire, or you can go to custom, and here you can adjust the service ratios down and change the number of people per facility. And this is how you'd account for the COVID era. The districts, so when you finish this, you'll notice what happens is you get your total number of your average size per shelter, which is easy when you have just one shelter. But you get your total number of people by role: supervisors, SAs, DMH, DHS, spiritual care, reunification, COTS, blankets. So all of your standard items you need for a shelter are specified here by using the ratio analysis that I mentioned earlier. So it's very easy to come up with. If you need to make customization, you can do that just by changing any of these standards here, and away you go with a new number. Any questions on this? I see one. Belinda's question. Sorry if you've answered this, if this is shifting out of mass care to other areas to being calculated off this. The tool only currently calculates mass care related ratios, but obviously you can see we've got IDC items in here as well. Things, mental health, spiritual care, disaster health services are all in individual client care and not mass care. So it does take care of some things that are not in mass care. You do see that it has cell phones on here and other items which are provided by DST, but the idea is what's used by mass care to deliver their services. So hopefully that addresses your question, Belinda. Okay. Showing that somebody has a raised hand. Kathy.
Yeah, let me come off mute. When you're talking about recovery from the mass care side, I'm assuming that is probably your shelter resident transition teams that are in the shelter working with the clients to get them out of the shelter. When we look at the caseworkers that are working outside of the shelter and into the community, whether it be a service center or with immediate assistance, or some of the outreach, are those caseworkers, are they counted in this mass care?
I may have led you astray there. I was giving an example of how I use ratios outside of mass care. Casework is not included in here, and in fact, they haven't added the shelter transition teams yet to the tool.
Are they going to be, because they're going to be actually part of mass care?
Correct.
Through mass care. Are they going to be part of the mass care planning tool?
That is the hope, but I think this version is going to get released as is. It's been through a lot of vetting. We'll have to see. It has not yet been released, and that may get added.
Okay.
But I don't know is the easy answer, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Right. Reunification is on here, Nancy. It is line 18. So we've got that. Oh, and Belinda had already answered it, so taken care of. So yes, reunification is often forgotten in mass care, but we are growing to love reunification and make them truly one of us in mass care. So yes, covered. Any questions on this? Is this, people were complaining that the earlier mass care tool was too complicated. I'm hoping that this is pretty straightforward. It's really just the two numbers and understanding what type of shelter you're going to be running. And for normal times, it's almost always the short term. Questions answered? This was a big deal when we had the earlier mass care tool. That's why I'm forcing this. Yes, Hillary, go.
This may be the dumbest question ever, but what do we mean by a 24-hour shelter? Does that literally mean it's only going to be open for a day?
Yep, yep. We have a lot of those. For example, I had to open one of those for a police action where we had an active shooter. It was open less than one. We only had one shift. So it was very, very short term.
Okay.
Evacuation in this term usually refers to hurricane evacuations where people may be in the shelter for 3 days, but we're still not providing cots and blankets because it's an evacuation and pre-impact. So yes, that was a surprising one to see in the list as well. And so the discussion we had today was whether we need to add a fifth one, which is a COVID shelter, or we just do it in custom. All right, any other questions? Oh, the question that came up here, do costs run off of this spreadsheet? And the answer is no. This spreadsheet develops resource requirements, and then the cost would be on the backside. And like any of the other planning tools, it does not generate an order. It doesn't generate a request for supplies. It doesn't generate a staffing request. It gives you instructions and guidance as far as what you may want to request, but it is not a direct, just like the 215 or the operational plan is not a staffing request or a supply request. Those things need to be backed up by 6409s. Yes, Hillary. Hillary, did you have another question?
No, as usual, forgot to lower my hand. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Hey,
Okay.
Carl, I have another question. What day do you do this plan?
Excellent question. If we go back to the presentation, generally, if you look back at the presentation here, and I covered this a little while ago, the operational plan is generally done in the first few days of the operation, and then it might be redone at the next phase. So generally, I would expect the operational plan to be done around day 2 or 3, and then it'll last for a week or so, and then you'll do a revised operational plan as directed if you need one. So it leads the service delivery plan. It's about the same time frame as the initial planning tool. You know, the key here is you need to staff up the operation quickly as the operation is rising, this green line here. And if you don't get the plan done, it's hard to judge whether you're going to have the right people. And the thing that I look at so much, if it's a major operation, you've got about a 3-day lag between requesting staff and having them arrive. Again, in normal times, and it could be far worse now. So the planning has to be done very quickly on the front end to make sure you've got the resources in place when you need them. Good question. I'm not sure why somebody else wanted control, but we won't go there. Okay, so that's the sheltering side. If you then go to the feeding side, come on, there we are. Okay, and these are the questions that I brought up on the first side. The feeding is a little more complicated because you've got to decide. The initial ones are still straightforward. It gives you a suggestion. I brought the number of people sheltered down to 50, and so it brings this over from the previous sheet. So you notice it's 100 here now. If we go back to the sheltering feed sheet, and we bring this number up to 500, for example. Let's go back to what I had before. Got 10 shelters for 500 people. I don't know why it's not doing my first letter, but that's okay. So now when we go back to the feeding sheet, it automatically bumps the suggested up to 2 meals a day delivered from the feeding to the shelter. So that gives you your first one there. You can adjust that. If you're doing 3 meals a day, you're including a hot breakfast, for example, then you'd want to bring this up to 1,500 in this case. But if you're doing the 2 meals a day hot, which is the default, then it's here. It's telling you how many shelters, which again goes toward how many vehicles you have. And then it asks you about community feeding. Community feeding is going to vary a lot in our wildfires. It is low for some of the hurricanes. It's quite large. So you'll need to adjust that, again, based on the input from the mass care chief and the ops team to the planning. And then you get your total number of meals needed. Then you go down to your strategies. Are you going to use shelf-stable meals? And what's interesting about this tool is if you answer the question, come on. It's not happy with me right now. I may finally have too many applications open. Anyway, if you answer the question differently, these black bars appear or disappear. So if you answer no here, then force it. So we enter no, and then the line disappears. So if you start out looking at the sheet and you see nothing but the black lines, come on. All right, be that way. The sections disappear. So only as you need them do they appear, and depending on which way you answer the questions. The kitchens are a little interesting now, but these are your standard kitchens from Southern Baptist and some of our other partners. The interesting thing is the Southern Baptists will be doing singly packed meals, but their capacity at their kitchens is going to be anticipated to be 25% of their normal capacity. So the feeding capacity is going to go down from the Southern Baptists, which is our biggest feeding partner nationally. Here in the West, we also, well, actually all the way across the country, we do also use World Central Kitchens, and so we'll work with them as well to figure out what the right ratios are. But most of our feeding partners can supply a lot fewer meals if they have to be individually packaged. The other things, of course, come down here in the Cambros. This was a really nice tool because all of us in mass care knew how to calculate the Cambro ratio and Cambros per vehicle, but this tool will do it all for you, so you don't need to come up through that knowledge. One of the things they're working on is how many prepackaged meals can fit in a Cambro? How many coolers can we fit in an herb? So how many meals can we deliver? Our old standard of 16 meals per day per herb is completely out the window now that we've got to do individually packed meals. Alex has a question. Why don't you go ahead, Alex?
Thank you. In regards to the count, when there is a shelter where individuals are not sleeping at the shelter but are registered, and they're either sleeping out on the grounds or out in RVs or at home and coming for services, but they're registered. So they're coming for food. Are we counting them as community or as part of the shelter count for the feeding numbers?
Well, the easy answer is don't forget them and get them in one place or the other. The normal answer is if they're registered in the shelter, then you'd probably count them as shelter population. Okay. But if they're not registered in the shelter, but just in the parking lot, then they wouldn't be. So it really depends on making sure you get the shelter counts right. And we've been working hard on that because we've had people in cars for the last couple of years at almost every major event, and we do normally count them separately. So you just need to be consistent and make sure people get their meals.
So is community then anything that is taken away from the shelter, not at the shelter?
Generally served away from the shelter. So if you think of the traditional seek and serve herb runs through neighborhoods, that would be community. Or if you have a fixed feeding site away from the shelter, that would be where that would come up normally.
Thank you.
You're welcome. At what level of DRO do you use this tool? Well, that is an excellent question. You can use this tool for a level 2 if you felt like it. I suspect you wouldn't. A level 2 is a large apartment fire. Its real value starts when you get to the bigger operations where it's not as easy to just estimate the number of meals that you're going to need. This is used anywhere from levels 3 through 7 in terms of operation. Okay. So these things are a work in progress, and this is what I was mentioning in terms of adjustments for the COVID era. The number of runs per day, the number of drivers, the number of meals served per herb. So we're going to have to work out these ratios. The number of shelters an herb can visit. Well, what's that going to be dependent on? If the shelters are very close to each other, an herb can probably reach 3 or 4 of them. If shelters are a long distance from the kitchen, sometimes I've had to have 2 separate herbs, one to serve the lunch meal at the distant shelter and one to serve the dinner, because they couldn't make the round trip time in order to do both with a single herb because the kitchen was just that far away. It was at the limits where we might have done catering for that shelter just based on the distance. So that will need to depend on your operation. And also recognize that you don't need to have an herb to deliver prepackaged meals. You don't need to have an herb to deliver Cambros. If they're going to be served in a shelter, you can have a box truck, you can have an SUV, you can have a lot of things deliver prepackaged meals. So it doesn't have to be an herb in this case here. There are some standard ratios here. If you've ever run a large kitchen, you know, one of the standard things to do is to have drive-up service at the kitchen for meals to be served directly from there. That's very common in the Southern Baptist kitchens. So you have to have a ratio to understand your meal planning of how many meals are going to be served there as opposed to served in the community or delivered at the shelters. And then the other information here about how many Cambros in a trailer. Again, right now with prepackaged meals, this is all meaningless, right? Because we're really not using Cambros. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to try and fit the few meals that you can into a Cambro, except for one point, in that Cambros are fabulous at holding their temperature. And one of the common complaints we've already heard of the early operations is food delivered in prepackaged containers is often cool by the time it gets to the residents. It has to be shipped, and any of you who've ever taken a meal by DoorDash or Uber Eats know the same problem. If it has to travel a long distance or sits on your porch for a while, it can cool quickly. And we have that problem in spades when we're delivering to non-congregate shelters. Any questions on this? This is the plan. I guess one of the things I didn't do is go back here a second. They've made the district allocation very simple. So for example, here, you're given the first column here is the required number of shelters and the required number of people. Then you assign how many per district. If you say 2 and 100 here, then it has another column here saying, well, what happened to the other shelters and what happened to the other 100 people? And so all you do is you allocate them to the right places, and you'll notice that the calculations here on the bottom of how many workers per district is automatically generated. When you want to do the plan, all you have to do is take this section of the chart and copy it and paste it into your plan. So it's very straightforward to have your district plan. And hopefully you don't copy that one because you want to make sure the numbers balance. So again, doing the districts is very straightforward. The same way doing the feeding per districts, the same idea. You've got a leftover unassigned column that you then allocate to the given district. based on the requirements that you put in the basic feeding plan. So you can do the districts, and then at the end of the day, here is the AOP for the feeding plan by district. Let's see, did we answer that one? So oh, okay, I guess that's just repeating the answer I gave. Yes, any size plan you can use the tool for. The bigger the better in terms of the tool, it'll get more value. A lot of you on this call have a lot of experience with level 2s and 3s and can probably do those in your sleep. The real challenge here is as the operation becomes larger and you have a lot more moving pieces. The same thing is then done with the DES side of it. So as it's not a surprise, same idea, you go through the DES, you answer the simple questions about where you're going to be distributing, when is the peak, and then you can separate it into districts in the same way, and it'll give you suggestions, and it generates your district AOP. And at the end of the day, you can fill in this nice chart, which produces bar charts of which tasks are being done at which times, based on your decision point table and your operational tasks and where the districts are, and it's generated. It looks beautiful when you create the result. One of the other things in the plan here, and if you're taking some of the new planning classes, they have a set of plans here. Click on this one. So you can do comparisons. So if you look at a comparison of two different options, so you might have option A or option B. In this case, and if you look in the guidance that you define the districts differently, you can then evaluate which plan is going to be most effective. And that is in the new guidance documents as well as how to go through an evaluation of two different options. And this comes again with larger operations where any of you who worked in Florence, for example, we were adjusting the districts on a regular basis depending on need and what support they required. So you can look through and evaluate multiple options based again on the data in the plan and see which one makes the most sense from a span of control standpoint, from a manageability standpoint of the operation. And again, the last tab I showed you earlier here, which is all of the metrics for how many shifts, for all what the measures are. And then there are some of the standard service items. So this table back here drives all of the calculations in the earlier tabs. I've gone through the tool. The new planning classes, yes, the new planning classes are all coming out theoretically in June, but we know that's not true. They're hopefully coming out around the 20th of July. And hopefully we'll be able to teach them here in our division as well. Okay, let me take you back to the slides. So what we've talked about here is how to develop the estimates of staffing. What I also wanted to show you is a couple of other staffing tools. The tool I showed you, the Mass Care Planning tool, not surprisingly, developed the plans for staffing around mass care. There are two other tools that are also available for helping with the planning. The first one here is the force package tool, which is for any generic disaster operations. How many people do you need by activity for level of operation, for level 3, 4, 5, all the way through a 7H operation, and in phases. So in the first phase, that's when you're scaling up the operation. You have a lot more mass care. Early operation probably has 40% of the staff is in mass care. Later in the operation, mass care has a much lighter footprint and other activities take over. So phases, so there are 4 phases in an operation that they separated into, phases 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see all of that. I like the hurricane tool, which is the second one here. because it's got a little more detail. In the hurricane tool, it provides the breakdown of the people. Somehow it's jumping. In the hurricane plan, it provides detail as far as how many people at the AD level, the chief, the manager, supervisor, and also the SA level, and it breaks it down by individual role and also in the initial wave and the second wave of the operation. So it's a very nice detailed assumption. Now, in reviewing those details with some of the teams in exercises, I was very surprised, for example, in external relations. For a level 5, they had 53 people in external relations. I've never been on an operation with 53 people in external relations, but talking to people on the East Coast, if you're staffing a large number of EOCs and you're doing a lot of outreach, it turns out that's the number you need based on historical information. So it's a little different. Certainly others here in external relations can speak to that more accurately for our regions, but it certainly depends a little bit by region. But this is the general guideline of what National would like to push to you to help you start up the operation once they know the level of the operation. And you as a leader will need to review these numbers and adjust them based on your guidance as far as how many people you need, but it gives you a point to start with. One of the hardest things for the Red Cross to do is to staff up quickly. Okay, so these tools are both available if you're interested as far as what the recommended staffing levels are. I'm certain for hurricanes in the islands that these force packages that are defined for the Southeast are probably different. I know in the Marianas, we staff at a much lower level than we do in Alabama or Mississippi, Florida. So it's going to be dependent regionally, but we could look at that, and certainly Chris Boyle or others could comment on the staffing levels for those areas. So these are really handy, and hopefully, if you look at the details, the mass care numbers do line up reasonably well between the two tools, so that shouldn't be a big surprise. Other questions that have come up?
Alex, this is Renee. You were, hi, you were mentioning.
Hey, welcome.
Hi, you were mentioning when you were pointing to this slide, you said, and over here is the hurricane. The print is really small, right. So where's your mouse at on the hurricane number that you're
chart
referencing?
Down here is the hurricane chart. The top one is the generic one for any disaster. The bottom one is the hurricane specific force package. Hurricane, it's called a HRFC, Hurricane Response Force Package, HRFC. Sweet. There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can get a copy of it. If you can't find it, let me know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know how you staff in Hawaii compared to this, which is primarily used on the East Coast.
We look at more local staff, and then we have to deplete our EBV option before we can ask for outside help. Specialized, like supervisors and above, are usually our priority to have sent in, but we cannot, as much as we would love to ask for SAs to come over and help us, we have to exhaust all of our local resources first.
And I bet you truly exhaust them.
Yeah, because we can't find them. So we have to make them. Thank you.
Excellent, you build them. I love that. Okay, other questions? Belinda, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I put the question in the chat box. So it was actually about the DES sheet. You had moved on before the question was answered. So I'm just wondering if numbers for the items that need to be ordered from logistics can get pulled off of some of those, or does that come from some other planning tool? Only because I've had inklings when I've talked to different people about how do they come to the numbers when they determine in aggregate the amount of bulk items they have to order.
Right, and that is in the tool in terms of what items, but again, the tool has been a bit of a challenge because the regions do quite a few different tools in terms of bulk items. In general, your stuff is going to be in the service delivery plan because that is where most of the bulk items are, and it's very rare for a DES to start before the service delivery plan is finished. And that has detailed assessments by line item of which things will be ordered by logistics.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
This one is more about how many trucks are you going to need and how many people are you going to need in here.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great question.
Yep.
Betsy, go ahead.
Carl, are these reports and numbers on the exchange? And if so, how do you find them?
Good questions, both of them. Some of them are on the exchange. I don't know about the hurricane planning tool and the staff force packages. I have not found those on the exchange, but I have people who send them to me. So and I'm willing to share. So this, for example, is the hurricane response force package, the detail version that was asked about earlier. And as you can see, it goes through each role of the operation. And one of the things I did was an analysis of how it compares to the other ones in terms of staffing ratios.
That would be great. And if you have a wildfire force pack, I'd love it if you would share that with me too.
To my knowledge, there is not a wildfire force package there. We just use the generic one for all events, which is the standard staffing force package or push package, force package. They use both terms. The disadvantage of that one doesn't have the breakdown by title, which is what I like about this one here.
Yeah, this is great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really handy tool. It made doing some of the exercises much more doable when you're scaling up in 2 days to a level 7. That takes your breath.
Yeah, knowing what to anticipate.
Yep. Okay. Other questions? Anybody else? I see one hand up. Oh, Betsy, that was you. Questions in chat. Okay. Can take care of that. And somebody, Alex, did you share the package already, or you just clipped the thing from the screen, it looks like?
I took a screenshot trying to enlarge it for folks.
Okay, we can do better. But thank you. Any other questions while we're here? Okay, so these were the tools I was showing you. We wanted to then take, I keep going backwards. We want to then take it a little step further because I like things to connect. And so ideally what we want to do is we want to take the mass care planning tool and the service delivery plan because those are our needs. And we want to take our staffing tools, and this is one that was developed by a team in Northern California here. Jody and Betsy worked on a bottom-up staffing plan. How many people do you have at a given shelter? And that meets in the middle. And I don't know why my screen has jumped. That meets in the middle at the 215, our operational planning worksheet. So the bottom sheets here are what you have. The top, in terms of the projections, are theoretically what you need, or what you are required for the operation. And then you wind up with the subtraction getting your need. In the ideal world, these tools match up. As I said, that rarely happens because you have certain environmental characteristics to your staff. The ratio of people and staff in shelters could be lopsided. We have a lot of small shelters and a couple of big ones, which would require more staff than if you had all even-sized shelters. You could need more care assistants. There could be other dynamics. But if you're thinking about it from a national scale and whether the NHQ is going to be questioning your plan, they're going to be looking at your standard ratio analysis of how many people are you doing on average, and then ask you to explain the difference. It's not that they're critical, they just want to understand what the differences are between them. And so that's theoretically how all the tools could fit together. This is one I've been working on here in terms of using the standard staffing reports to come up, using the standard staffing reports to come up with how many people you have and how many people you need using the other projections. And hopefully we can get that generated automatically in the decision support team in the next few months. And that would be wonderful to have as well. Other questions? We've done well in using our time. I think we've addressed most of the questions as they've come along. Are there any that I've missed? Okay, hearing none. This is some of the guidance that you can use as reference. You know, the DRO Advanced Operational Planning tool is out. The, of course, Concept of Operations has a lot on the planning. The Mass Care Management class has a lot on planning. And the other items that I've shown here being the Mass Care Planning tool, the Mass Care, the practice exercises that go with the planning tool, and some of the planning assumptions toolkits, those are all scheduled for release in July. So hopefully around the 20th or shortly thereafter. And the new the new advanced planning class will also be coming out around that same time, and hopefully we'll be able to present it shortly thereafter. That is the conclusion of the presentation. Any remaining questions? I have either overwhelmed you or bored you to tears. I'm not sure which, but we'll go with pleasantly surprised.
All right. Thank you very much, Carl, for helping us out with that tonight. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And then just a reminder, everyone, tomorrow night at 4 p.m. we'll be having the difficult conversations and looking at the platinum rule. So we invite you to come back to that tomorrow night, 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Carl.
You're all welcome.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carl.